The dust swirled thick in the afternoon heat, kicked up by restless boots and the nervous shifting of horses tied to the hitching posts along Main Street. Clearwater Creek wasn't much more than a handful of weathered buildings squatting beneath the merciless Arizona sun, but today it buzzed with an energy that made the very air seem to crackle. Word had spread for miles around about the auction, drawing ranchers, drifters, and opportunists from across the territory like vultures to carrion. Eleanor Morrison stood on the makeshift platform outside Hutchins' general store, her wrists bound in iron shackles that had worn raw patches on her skin. The chains connecting her ankles allowed only the smallest of steps, and she held herself as straight as she could manage, despite the weight of the metal and the crushing weight of her circumstances. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and though her calico dress was torn and stained from weeks of travel, she maintained a dignity that seemed to confound the leering crowd gathered below. She had been 23 years old when her world collapsed. The daughter of a respected doctor in St. Louis, she had lived a life of relative comfort until her father's gambling debts caught up with him. One morning she had awakened to find strange men in their parlor, her father dead by his own hand, and herself suddenly property to be sold to the highest bidder to settle his obligations. The law was clear, even if it was cruel, and Eleanor had learned quickly that justice and fairness were luxuries she could no longer afford. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Briggs who seemed to take perverse pleasure in his work, gestured toward Eleanor with his gavel. "Here we have a fine specimen, gentlemen. Young, strong, educated, can read and write, cook and clean. Perfect for domestic work or—" He let his words trail off with a knowing smile that made Eleanor's stomach turn. "Bidding starts at $50. The crowd pressed closer, and Eleanor fought to keep her expression neutral as rough hands pointed at her and voices called out numbers. She had learned during the long journey west that showing fear only encouraged the worst kinds of men. Instead, she focused on the horizon beyond the crowd, where purple mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. Somewhere out there was freedom, though it felt as distant as the stars. "60, called a voice from the back. "75, shouted another. Eleanor's gaze swept the crowd without meaning to, taking in the faces of the men who would determine her fate. Most looked exactly as she had expected, hardened by sun and wind, their eyes calculating the value of human flesh like they would a horse or a head of cattle. But then her attention caught on a figure standing apart from the others, leaning against a post at the edge of the crowd. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar and a beard that couldn't quite hide a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking at her with hunger or appraisal. Instead, his gray eyes held something that looked almost like sadness. He wore simple clothes, worn denim, and a cotton shirt that had seen better days, and his boots were scuffed with honest work. There was something about the way he held himself, apart but not aloof, that made Eleanor think of a wolf watching a hunt from the tree line. $100. The bid came from Bull Hendricks, a massive man whose ranch sprawled across thousands of acres north of town. Eleanor had heard whispers about Hendricks during the journey, stories that made her blood run cold. He owned a dozen women already, it was said, and none of them had lasted more than a few years before disappearing entirely. The crowd grew more animated as the price climbed. Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Hendricks smiled up at her, his gold teeth glinting in the harsh sunlight. She had survived this long by refusing to let despair take hold, but looking down at his face, she felt something inside her begin to crack. $125, called another voice. $150. Hendricks countered immediately, his smile never wavering. The quiet man by the post straightened slightly, his hand moving to rest on something at his belt. Eleanor realized it was a gun, though he wore it differently than most men lower on his hip. The leather worn smooth from countless draws. There was something familiar about the movement, like a dancer who had performed the same steps 10,000 times. $175. The bid came from a rancher Eleanor didn't recognize, a thin man with cruel eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. Hendricks laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. $200, and let's be done with this foolishness. The crowd fell silent. $200 was more than most men made in 6 months, an astronomical sum for human property. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, feeling the last of her hope drain away like water through sand. When she opened them again, the quiet man was looking directly at her. For a moment, the chaos of the auction faded away. Their eyes met across the distance, and Eleanor saw something she hadn't seen in months: recognition of her humanity. Not appraisal, not calculation, but simple acknowledgement that she was a person with thoughts and fears and dreams. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across a chasm, and Eleanor felt herself breathe for what felt like the first time in weeks. 200 going once, called Briggs, his gavel raised. The quiet man pushed away from the post and took a step forward. 250. His voice was soft, barely audible above the murmur of the crowd, but something in it made every conversation stop. Hendricks turned to stare at him, his face darkening like a thundercloud. The quiet man met his gaze without flinching, his hand still resting casually on his gun. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered someone in the crowd. "That's Jacob Reeves." The name rippled through the gathering like wind through wheat. Eleanor saw recognition dawn on face after face, followed quickly by something that looked like fear. Even Hendricks seemed to reconsider, his hand moving instinctively to his own weapon before stopping short. 250 going once, called Briggs, his voice suddenly uncertain. Going twice. Hendricks opened his mouth as if to bid again, then closed it. His eyes never left Jacob Reeves, and Eleanor could see the calculation happening behind them. Whatever reputation this quiet man carried, it was enough to give even Bull Hendricks pause. Sold to Mr. Reeves for $250. The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot, and Eleanor felt her knees nearly give way. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Hendricks spat in the dust and stalked away, but not before giving Jacob one last measuring look that promised this wasn't over. Jacob approached the platform slowly, counting out bills from a leather wallet. Eleanor watched him climb the wooden steps, noting the way he moved, economical, purposeful, like a man who had learned not to waste motion. Up close, she could see that his eyes were the color of storm clouds, and the scar on his face was old, silvered with time. "The chains," he said quietly to Briggs, who had pocketed the money with obvious relief. "Oh yes, of course." Briggs fumbled for a key ring, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked Eleanor's shackles. The iron fell away from her wrists and ankles with a sound like redemption, leaving behind angry red marks that Jacob's eyes lingered on for just a moment. Eleanor rubbed her wrists, hardly daring to believe it was real. The absence of the chains felt like floating after months of carrying stones. She looked up at Jacob, trying to read his intentions in his weather-beaten face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from Dessous. He nodded once, then gestured toward the street. "We should go." Eleanor followed him down from the platform on unsteady legs, acutely aware that every eye in the remaining crowd was on them. Jacob's horse was tied nearby, a sturdy gray mare who looked like she could run all day without complaint. He untied her and handed Eleanor the reins. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Some," Eleanor replied, though it had been years since she'd been on horseback. Jacob helped her up onto the mare, his touch gentle and impersonal. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. Eleanor tensed at first, but something in the way he held himself, careful not to crowd her, leaving space between them despite the narrow saddle, told her she had nothing to fear from this man. They rode out of Clearwater Creek in silence, leaving behind the dust and noise and hungry eyes. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor had expected to feel relief, but instead she felt oddly hollow, as if some essential part of herself had been left behind on that platform. "Where are we going?" she finally asked when the town had disappeared behind them. "My place," Jacob replied. "It's not much, but it's private. We need to talk." They rode for nearly an hour through country that grew more beautiful with each mile. The harsh desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and crossed by clear streams. Wildlife moved through the brush, deer and rabbits and birds that filled the evening air with song. It was the first beauty Eleanor had seen in months, and she found herself drinking it in like water after a long drought. Jacob's ranch, when it finally appeared, was as modest as he had promised. A simple wooden house sat in a grove of cottonwoods beside a creek, with a barn and a few outbuildings scattered nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows onto a covered porch lined with chairs. It looked like what home should look like, Eleanor thought, though she couldn't remember the last time she had truly had one. Jacob helped her down from the horse and led her toward the house. "You must be hungry," he said, "and tired. We can talk after you've had a chance to rest." The interior of the house was as unpretentious as its owner, clean wooden floors, simple furniture, and books scattered on every available surface. Eleanor noticed a guitar leaning in one corner and wondered if this quiet man made music in the evenings when the day's work was done. "There's a room upstairs you can use," Jacob said, lighting a lamp. "Clean clothes in the dresser should fit well enough. Take your time." Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs on legs that felt like water. The room he had indicated was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the creek and the hills beyond. On the dresser sat a pitcher of clean water and a washbasin, luxuries she hadn't enjoyed in months. Clean clothes were folded neatly in the drawers, simple but well-made dresses that looked like they had belonged to a woman of similar size. She washed the dust and grime from her skin with something approaching reverence, watching months of dirt and despair swirl down the drain. The clean dress felt like armor against the world, restoring some sense of herself that she had thought lost forever. When she looked in the mirror above the dresser, she barely recognized the woman staring back, thin and marked by hardship, but still herself. Downstairs, Jacob had prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, along with coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. They ate in comfortable silence at first, Eleanor too hungry to do anything but focus on the food. It was the best meal she had tasted in months, made better by the absence of chains and the presence of someone who treated her like a human being. "I should explain," Jacob said when they had finished eating. He refilled their coffee cups and leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around the warm ceramic. "I know you must have questions." Eleanor studied his face in the lamplight. "Why did you buy me?" "Because nobody deserves to be owned," he said simply. "And because I knew what Hendricks would do to you." "But $250, that's a fortune. You don't even know me." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "I had a sister once. Rebecca, she was about your age when something similar happened to her. I wasn't there to help her then. Maybe this is my way of trying to make up for that." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "What happened to her?" "She died," Jacob said quietly. 5 years ago. The man who owned her worked her to death on his ranch up in Colorado. By the time I found out where she was, it was too late." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words settling between them like stones in still water. Eleanor thought about the quiet way he had spoken her name, the careful distance he maintained, the sadness in his eyes when he had first seen her on that platform. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Jacob nodded acknowledgement of her sympathy. "The point is you're free now. Really free. I have papers that say you belong to me, but I'll burn them if you want. You can stay here as long as you need to figure out what comes next, or you can leave tomorrow morning if that's what you prefer. Either way, nobody owns you anymore." Eleanor stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You'd really do that?"
"Just let me go."
"It's not letting you go," Jacob corrected gently. "It's acknowledging what should have been true all along, that you have the right to choose your own path." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. So unexpected was their kindness. She had grown accustomed to being treated like property, to having every aspect of her life decided by others. The idea that she could simply choose felt revolutionary and terrifying at the same time. "I don't know where I would go," she admitted. "I don't have any family left, no money, no skills that would keep me alive out here." "You have time to figure it out," Jacob said. "And if you decide to stay for a while, there's plenty of work around here. The ranch doesn't run itself, and I could use help with the books. I saw the way you carry yourself. Figured you for an educated woman." Eleanor looked around the simple kitchen, at the warm light in the books and the evidence of a life lived with purpose and dignity. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. "What kind of work?" she asked. Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Everything. Horses need tending, cattle need counting, books need keeping. Garden needs planting come spring. House needs cleaning, though I try to keep it tidy. Nothing you couldn't learn if you had a mind to. And you'd pay me. Real wages." "Real wages," Jacob confirmed. "It plus room and board. It's not charity, I genuinely need the help. Ranch has been struggling since my father died last year. Been trying to do everything myself, and it's more than one person can handle." Eleanor felt tears threatening and blinked them back. She had cried enough in the past months to fill a river. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Maybe because kindness costs nothing." And I've seen too much of what happens when people forget that. Maybe because everyone deserves a chance to build something better. Or maybe because this old house gets awful quiet sometimes, and it would be nice to have someone around who appreciates good coffee and doesn't mind listening to me practice guitar in the evenings. Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling. It felt strange on her face, like a muscle she had forgotten how to use. "You play guitar?" "Badly," Jacob admitted with a rueful grin. Fair warning. They talked long into the night, and Eleanor learned pieces of the story that had brought this quiet man to a place where he would spend a fortune to free a stranger. Jacob had grown up on this ranch, the youngest of 3 children. His older brother had died in the war, his sister had been sold into servitude to pay their father's medical debts, and Jacob had spent 5 years afterward tracking down every lead, following every rumor, until he finally found Rebecca's grave in a potter's field outside Denver. "That's when I decided to come home," he said, staring into the dying fire in the hearth. "Figured if I couldn't save her, maybe I could save someone else someday. Didn't expect that day to come so soon." Eleanor told him about her own story, the comfortable childhood, her father's gradual descent into gambling addiction. The morning she woke up to find herself alone and enslaved. She spoke about the journey west, the other women who had shared her fate, the slow erosion of hope that had nearly broken her spirit entirely. "But it didn't break you," Jacob observed quietly. "You're still here, still fighting." "Am I?" Eleanor asked. "Most days it felt like I was just surviving." "Sometimes that's the same thing," Jacob said. "Sometimes surviving is the biggest fight there is." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Eleanor woke in a real bed for the first time in months, between clean sheets under a roof that belonged to someone who had no intention of hurting her. For a few precious moments before full wakefulness returned, she felt almost like the person she used to be. Downstairs, Jacob was already up and dressed, coffee percolating on the stove and breakfast cooking in a cast-iron skillet. He looked up when she entered the kitchen, his gray eyes searching her face. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Eleanor admitted. "Thank you." They ate breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, painting the hills gold and green. Eleanor found herself noticing details she had been too exhausted to appreciate the night before, the way Jacob's hands moved with quiet competence as he poured coffee, the shelf of books by the window, the guitar propped in its corner like a faithful friend. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Eleanor said finally, "about staying, about work." Jacob looked at her expectantly but didn't push. "I'd like to try," she continued, "if the offer is still open. I can't promise I'll know how to do everything, but I'm willing to learn." Jacob's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains. "The offer is always open, and nobody expects you to know everything right away. Learning is half the point." They spent the morning walking the ranch, Jacob explaining the layout and showing Eleanor the various animals that would become her responsibility. There were horses in the corral, sturdy working animals with intelligent eyes and gentle dispositions. Cattle grazed in the pastures beyond, fat and healthy despite the approach of winter. Chickens pecked around the yard, and Eleanor laughed out loud when a bold rooster strutted directly up to her as if demanding introduction. "That's Napoleon," Jacob said with amusement. "Fair warning, he thinks he runs the place." "Maybe he does," Eleanor replied, watching the rooster eye her with regal disdain before stalking away to terrorize a bug. The work, when they began it in earnest, was harder than anything Eleanor had ever done. Her hands, soft from years of genteel living, blistered and blood from handling rope and tools. Her back ached from bending over garden plots and her shoulders burned from carrying feed buckets. But for the first time in months, she fell asleep each night with the satisfaction of honest labor rather than the despair of captivity. Jacob was a patient teacher, showing her how to read the signs of sick cattle, how to calm a spooked horse, how to keep books that would tell them whether the ranch was turning a profit or sliding toward ruin. In the evenings, after the work was done, he would play his guitar on the front porch while Eleanor mended clothes or read from his extensive library. His playing was indeed mediocre, but there was something touching about the way he bent over the instrument, concentration furrowing his brow, as he worked through a particularly challenging passage. "My father played," he told her one evening when she complimented his improvement. "He tried to teach all of us, but I was the only one who stuck with it. Rebecca used to say I played like I was trying to strangle the music out of it." Eleanor smiled. She sounds like she had a sense of humor. She did. Even at the end, even when things got bad, she could still make people laugh. Jacob's fingers stilled on the strings. I think she would have liked you. The words settled between them with unexpected weight. Eleanor found herself looking at Jacob's profile in the lamplight, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he concentrated, the scar that she had stopped noticing weeks ago. Somewhere along the way, without her quite realizing it, this place had begun to feel like home and this man had begun to feel like family. I think I would have liked her too, Eleanor said quietly. As autumn deepened into winter, Eleanor's hands grew calloused and strong. She learned to read the sky for signs of weather, to gentle a frightened calf, to make bread that didn't taste like it was made from sawdust and hope. More importantly, she began to remember who she was beneath the fear and pain of the past year. She had opinions again, preferences, moments of pure joy when she caught sight of deer grazing in the morning mist or heard a hawk calling from high overhead. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Eleanor's education proved invaluable for managing the business side of the operation, while her growing practical skills meant Jacob could focus on the heavier physical labor. They worked well together, developing an easy rhythm of cooperation that made even the hardest days manageable. But it was the evenings Eleanor treasured most. After the sun went down and the chores were finished, they would sit on the front porch regardless of weather, talking about everything and nothing. Jacob told her stories about his childhood, about the brother who had died at Bull Run, and the father who had never quite recovered from the loss. Eleanor shared memories of her life in St. Louis, the patients who had come to her father's practice, the books she had read and the dreams she had harbored before everything fell apart. What did you want to be? Jacob asked one night as the first snow of winter began to fall. Before all this happened, what were your plans? Eleanor considered the question, trying to remember the girl she had been. I wanted to travel, she said finally, see places I'd only read about in books, maybe write about them, help other people see the world through words. You still could, Jacob said quietly, someday, when you're ready. But sitting there on the porch, watching snow dust the hills like powdered sugar, Eleanor found she wasn't sure she wanted to leave anymore. The world beyond these mountains had shown her cruelty and degradation. Here, she had found something she hadn't expected, not just safety, but belonging. Winter brought challenges neither of them had anticipated. The worst blizzard in 20 years trapped them in the house for a week, with snow piled so deep against the windows that the rooms stayed dark even at midday. They huddled around the fireplace, playing cards and reading aloud to each other from Jacob's collection of books. It was during that week that Eleanor realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling in love with this quiet, scarred man who had bought her freedom and asked nothing in return. The realization came gradually, then all at once. It was in the way Jacob always made sure she had the most comfortable chair by the fire. In the careful distance he maintained, never presuming upon their living arrangement. In the way his eyes sought her face when he told a particularly good story, looking for her smile like it was the finest reward he could imagine. But most of all, it was in the way he had never once, in all their months together, made her feel like she owed him anything for her freedom. He had given her the most precious gift imaginable, herself, and treated it like it cost him nothing at all. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it an explosion of wildflowers that turned the hills into a painter's palette. Eleanor walked among them one morning, gathering a bouquet for the kitchen table. When she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast, she looked up to see a rider cresting the hill at full gallop, Jacob, returning from town with supplies. But something was wrong. He was riding harder than he ever did unless there was trouble, and even from a distance she could see the tension in his posture. Eleanor dropped her flowers and ran toward the house, her heart hammering with sudden dread. Jacob reined up in the yard, his horse lathered with sweat and blowing hard. Eleanor, he called, swinging down from the saddle. We need to talk. What is it? What's happened? Jacob's face was grim as he tied his horse to the hitching post. Hendricks was in town. He's been asking questions, making noise about filing legal challenges. Says he has a prior claim on you. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had known this peace couldn't last forever, but she had begun to hope that maybe, just maybe, the past would stay buried. Can he do that? I don't know, Jacob admitted. The law is murky on these things, And Hendricks has money and influence. He could make trouble for us, maybe tie things up in court for months. What does he want? Jacob's jaw tightened. He's never forgotten being outbid at that auction. His pride got wounded. And men like Hendricks don't forget things like that. Eleanor sank down onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. For months she had been living in a kind of dream, believing she was truly free. Now the old nightmare was reaching out to drag her back. There's something else, Jacob said quietly. He's not just planning legal action. Word is he's hired some men. The kind who don't worry too much about what's legal and what isn't. If the courts don't give him what he wants, he might try to take it anyway. Then I have to leave, Eleanor said, the words tearing out of her throat like broken glass. I won't bring that kind of trouble down on you. You've done enough. Jacob knelt in front of her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Eleanor, look at me. She met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected in their gray depths. You're not bringing trouble on me, he said firmly. Hendricks is, and I'll be damned if I let him take you away from here. Jacob, you don't understand. If he comes with hired guns, then we'll deal with it, Jacob interrupted, together. I didn't buy your freedom just to hand you over to the first man who wants to steal it away. Eleanor stared at him, overwhelmed by the fierce protectiveness in his voice. Why? Why would you risk everything for me? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his hands still resting on her shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was so soft she had to lean forward to hear it. Because I love you, he said simply. Because these months with you have been the best of my life, and I can't bear the thought of losing you. Because you deserve to be free and happy and safe. And I'll fight anyone who tries to take that away from you. Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks, not the bitter tears of despair she had shed so often in the past, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and joy. Jacob, I know it's complicated, he said quickly. I know the circumstances of how we met make everything strange. If you don't feel the same way, I understand. But regardless of what happens between us, I won't let Hendricks take you. Eleanor reached up to touch his scarred face, marveling at the way he leaned into her touch like a man dying of thirst. I love you too, she whispered. I have for months. I was just afraid to say it. Jacob closed his eyes as if her words were a physical blow. When he opened them again, she saw something blazing there that took her breath away. Then we face this together, he said, rising and pulling her up with him. Whatever comes. They had 3 days to prepare before Hendricks arrived, and they used them well. Jacob rode to the neighboring ranches, calling in favors and asking for help from men who knew his character and respected his family name. Eleanor spent hours loading cartridges and cleaning weapons, her hands steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. They moved supplies into the house, barricaded the windows, and prepared for a siege. But when the confrontation finally came, it wasn't at all what Eleanor had expected. Hendricks arrived alone, riding up to the house in broad daylight with his hands visible and empty. He was still the massive, intimidating man Eleanor remembered from the auction, but something in his posture suggested he hadn't come for a fight. Jacob met him in the yard, rifle in hand but not quite pointed at their visitor. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window, her own weapon ready but hidden from view. Hendricks, Jacob said simply. You're not welcome here. Bull Hendricks dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Reeves, we need to talk. Nothing to talk about. Eleanor stays here. That's what I came to tell you, Hendricks said, surprising them both. I'm withdrawing my claim. Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger. This some kind of trick. No trick. Hendricks removed his hat and ran thick fingers through his graying hair. Had a visit from some folks yesterday. Federal marshals. Seems they've been investigating my business practices, looking into complaints about the way I've been treating my employees. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. She opened the kitchen door and stepped onto the porch, her rifle held loosely but ready. Hendricks looked up at her, and for just a moment she saw something that might have been shame cross his features. Miss Morrison, you're looking well? I am well? Eleanor replied steadily. And I intend to stay that way. Hendricks nodded. Good, that's good. He turned back to Jacob. Point is, I can't afford any more attention from federal law enforcement. Too much scrutiny on my affairs already. Last thing I need is a legal battle that might expose things better left buried. So you're just giving up? Jacob asked suspiciously. Just like that. Hendricks confirmed. But I want something in return. Jacob's rifle came up a fraction of an inch. What kind of something? Your word that what happened here stays here. No talking to marshals, no spreading stories around town. I disappear from your lives. You disappear from mine." Jacob and Eleanor exchanged a long look. Eleanor could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him wanted to see justice done, to make sure Hendricks paid for all the women he had hurt. But the practical part of him knew that sometimes survival was more important than justice. "Don't," Jacob said finally. "But if you ever come near Eleanor again, if you ever threaten anyone else the way you threatened her, our deal is off." Hendricks nodded once, sharp and businesslike. "Understood." He remounted his horse, then paused. "For what it's worth, Reeves, you got a good woman there. Treat her right." He rode away without looking back, leaving Jacob and Eleanor standing in their yard in stunned silence. Eleanor felt her legs give out, and she sat down hard on the porch steps, her rifle clattering forgotten beside her. "Is it over?" she whispered. "Is it really over?" Jacob set his own rifle aside and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "It's over," he said against her hair. "You're free. Really, truly free." They held each other as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor felt something inside her chest, that had been clenched tight for over a year, finally begin to relax. The future stretched out before them like an unwritten book, full of possibility and hope. "So what now?" she asked when they finally pulled apart. Jacob smiled, his scarred face transformed by joy. "Now we build a life together, if that's what you want. We work the ranch, we make music on the porch, we watch the seasons change. We be happy." Eleanor thought about the girl she had been in St. Louis, with her dreams of travel and adventure. Those dreams seemed small now compared to what she had found here: love, purpose, a place to belong. Maybe the greatest adventure was simply learning to call somewhere home. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They were married in the spring, in a simple ceremony on the front porch of the house that had become their sanctuary. The preacher from town performed the service, while half a dozen neighboring ranchers and their families looked on. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Jacob had bought in town, simple white cotton that moved like water in the mountain breeze. The scarred man who had bought her freedom became the husband who gave her everything else: laughter and partnership, and a love so deep it sometimes took her breath away. They worked the ranch together through good seasons and bad, built up the herd and improved the land, made a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. Years later, when people asked Eleanor about her story, she would think carefully before answering. She could tell them about the auction, about the chains and the fear and the moment when everything changed. She could talk about the long road from slavery to freedom, about the man who paid $250 for the privilege of setting her free. But what she usually said was simpler than that. She would smile and look out at the mountains that had become her home, at the man who still played guitar badly on the front porch, at the children who filled their house with joy and chaos and the sound of the future being born. "I was lost," she would say, "and then I was found." It was, she knew, the truest story of all.